Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be doing some super quick and really easy Halloween DIYs for part 7 of the Summer-Ween series. This project is a super easy dupe for these bat taper candles from Anthropologie. You'll need some white taper candles for this project. I'm just using some from the dollar store. I'll also be using these Halloween themed temporary tattoos that I got off of Amazon. And I do have these linked down below in the description box in my Amazon storefront, but they are really nice and come with a variety of different ones. So I'm actually going to be making a few of these. The first one I'm starting with is the bat one so that I can copy the Anthropologie one. For each one of these candles, I only ended up using one sheet a piece, and just like you would on your skin with these temporary tattoos, you're going to put them where you want them, use a damp cloth, and transfer these over to the candle. Now, as I was doing these, I did figure out that it was a lot easier for me to place these where I wanted them, spray them with a little bit of water, and then just wrap that damp cloth around to finish transferring them. And making all 4 of these took only a few minutes. For this quick little project, I'm going to be making over this ghost clock that I found at the thrift store last year. I never got around to making it over last year, so I figured I could just quickly do it this year. I'm going to roll out a little bit of air dry clay because I did like the general idea of this clock being a ghost clock, but instead of it being cutesy ghost, I thought I could go a little bit more spooky. So I ended up rolling that air dry clay out to be pretty thin, and then I'm going to drape it over this clock and start shaping it around the original ghost. Once I have it shaped pretty nicely, then I'm going to use a razor blade and cut away a lot of the excess clay. Again, I am just using the general shape that the ghost already was around the clock center. I did cover up the jack-o'-lantern that was on there, so I decided to add back in a little pumpkin just using this mold that I got from Amazon. It is a 2-part mold, and I'm just going to use that one side to make half a pumpkin to put up against the ghost. But before I add the pumpkin, I am going to take a little bit of water on my finger and go over this ghost, smoothing out all the edges and any little imperfections. Then I used a little bit of gel super glue to attach that pumpkin right to the front, and again dipping my fingers down into some water and smoothing out the edges around the pumpkin. Then I just set this aside to let that air dry clay dry overnight. And the next day, I went over this entire thing with 2 coats of some white chalk paint. I let that dry completely, and then for the pumpkin, I'm going to be using this DIY paint that Sammy from Unicorn Dust Designs actually sent to me. It's a really beautiful orange color, and I think it's called Summer Crush, but it ended up being a perfect color for the fall. Once I had the pumpkin painted, I went back in with a little bit of dark brown paint, painted the stem, and then also added the little details around the pumpkin. Then while that brown paint was still wet, I went back in with a little bit more of that orange paint to blend it all together. Then I just used my black paint marker to add 2 little eyes to the ghost. And to finish it off, I used some glossy Mod Podge and did 2 coats over this entire thing. For this project, I'm using this resin book that I found at the thrift store, and I'm just going to start by removing that little gold rope from the center. Then I'm going to paint over the entire front of this book with some chalk paint in the color plaster, and I'm going to do 2 coats of this on here. Once it was dry, then I'm going to go all around the edges of the front and also on the back side of the cover with some black chalk paint. I did consider putting something on the back of this, but since this is going to be propped up, no one's really going to see this backside, but I did do 2 coats of that black chalk paint. Back to the inside of the book, I found this 1600s book on the public domain. This is actually a book about witchcraft and spirits, so I printed out both of these pages on some rice paper, and then I'm just going to use a little bit of Mod Podge to place these inside the book. And I do have both of these pages along with some other Halloween graphics and photos on my blog. The link is going to be in the description below. Once I had both of these pages glued down, then I did go back over them with a light coating of some more Mod Podge. Then it was time to distress the book again. Since I had painted over it, I just used a little bit of some antiquing wax to start with and a fluffy brush and just went over all the book pages and over those pages that I had added. Then to further distress it, I used some of my black wax that I made with that same fluffy brush and went over it again. To finish this off, instead of adding that gold rope back to the center of it, I ended up using a piece of black velvet ribbon. For this project, I'm going to be using some hand mirrors. All of these I have picked up from the thrift store at some point in time. For the 2 on the left-hand side, I was able to remove the mirror, but the one on the right-hand side, the mirror was glued into it and I wasn't able to remove it. I'm going to be turning these into some picture frames. So I have these vintage prints that I had printed out at Walgreens. I also have these 3 pictures on my blog as well. For the 2 I was able to remove, I actually just used the mirror insert to trace around onto the photos to know where I needed to cut them. For the one I wasn't able to remove, I just used a piece of paper and traced around the center of that mirror so that I could use that template. Now, I didn't need all of my mirrors to be an exact match of each other, but I did want them to kind of go together, and since this black one was just too stark, I did go over it with a little bit of European gold rub and buff. And since this gold one had a lot of yellow in it, I did the same for this one as well. Then to add the pictures inside of these mirrors, I just used a little bit of glue and brushed it around so that it wouldn't be a ton of glue. And then I just added in all of those pictures. For this quick little project, I'm using this little old scrub brush that I found at the thrift store, as well as this vintage photo of a lady that I found on Google. I do have this photo for free download on my blog, but I just ended up printing this on a piece of cardstock in about a 5x7 size. I wanted to turn her into a witch, so I just used a piece of printer paper to make a witch hat template. Then I'm going to use a piece of adhesive felt velvet paper. I got this on Amazon as well, but this is what I'm going to use to make her witch hat. So I'll just use the little template I made and then trace that on the back side of this velvet paper. And since this already has the adhesive on the backside, all I had to do was peel off that paper and then place this on top of her head. Now, as you may have already guessed, I want to use that scrub brush as a picture frame to hold this photo, but I did want to age it up a little bit, so I used some of my homemade black wax and just went over this with a paintbrush and then wiped off a lot of the excess with a paper towel. For this project, I wanted to try to recreate these cute little ghosts. These are actually $185. So I picked up some of these sconce shades from the thrift store. As you can see, I started out with 3 of these, but I ended up dropping that middle one and breaking it. So I'll be working on the larger one first. I'm going to grab some air dry clay and roll it up into kind of a cone shape to make that top portion of this ghost. I'm also using some water to smooth it all out, and I want those end parts that are meeting the top of the ghost to be really smooth and thin. I didn't have to glue this piece onto the top. These sconce shades have that little end piece at the top of them. I just slid my air dry clay right over top of there. Once I have the top piece done, then I'm just going to be taking small pieces of air dry clay and flatten those in my hand. I want all of these pieces to be pretty much paper thin, so I'm making sure that all of the edges are really thin and smoothed out. Then I'm just using some of that water on my finger and really smoothing everything out and combining the pieces into each other. I continued working my way around and down this ghost, just using the thin small pieces of air dry clay and blending it all together. Make sure you're keeping the air dry clay nice and wet so that it doesn't tear. And if it does happen to tear, you can always just add another little piece of clay over top of it. Once I have it covered, then I wanted to make the little eyes and the mouth on here so that I could light this from the inside. So I just used a paintbrush to make the holes and then used a Q-tip to clean it up. Once I finished with this one, then I repeated that process on that smaller one and set these aside to dry for 24 hours. The next day, I gave both of these a really light sanding with some fine grit sandpaper, and then I am going to do 2 coats of some white acrylic paint over top of these, just being very careful not to get it in the eyes or the mouth. Once both coats were fully dry, then I decided to use some super glossy Mod Podge over top of these to give them a nice little sheen. And I did end up doing 2 coats of this Mod Podge over these. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.